In this short video, we will look at the January Parliament of 1398, sometimes called the Shrewsbury Parliament. The aims of the video are twofold. Firstly, where was the Parliament held and why was there a change in location? And secondly, what was agreed at this Parliament? Well, firstly, the Parliament met on the 27th of January 1398, and it should really be seen as a continuation from the September 1397 Parliament. This was a chance for Richard and for members of the nobility that were loyal to Richard to tie up the loose ends from that Parliament. Richard didn't waste any time at this Parliament. It only lasted for 4 days, but these were an incredibly significant 4 days. The historian Stubbs has labelled this particular Parliament as suicidal for Richard. So why did Richard choose to hold this Parliament in Shrewsbury rather than in Westminster? Well, Shrewsbury is located in Shropshire, and Shropshire borders Cheshire. So Richard perhaps was wanting to be close to his personal affinity, the Cheshire Archers, and also for the fact that Shrewsbury was located very close to Wales, where there was a few border disputes. Also, it was very close to Ireland, and there'd been a number of problems in Ireland since Richard's expedition in 1394 and 1395. So it's clear that Richard wanted to feel secure at this Parliament, having it close to his personal affinity around Cheshire. But why did it take him 4 months to settle a lot of issues from the September Parliament? Well, there's a divided opinion based on this. The historian Nigel Saul believes that Richard needed to quell Thomas Mowbray and wanted him to settle down after the September Parliament. If you remember, Thomas Mowbray was a former appellant, but he wasn't trialled or judged at the September Parliament. A different historian, May McKissock, in her book The 14th Century, says that Richard was so confident in his new power that he didn't feel the need to rush to make these decisions. What historians can agree on, though, is what was recorded at this Parliament and what was agreed upon by Richard and his new nobility. Because it is a Parliament, we have the parliamentary rolls to prove actually what took place. The first main point to consider is that Richard elevated a number of close supporters to members of the nobility. So Thomas Despencer became the Earl of Gloucester, a title that was previously held by Thomas Woodstock, Richard's uncle. Thomas Percy, a northerner, became Earl of Worcester, and William Scrope, who had successfully held the Earl of Arundel in the Isle of Wight, became Earl of Wiltshire. Richard also rewarded a number of nobility that had helped him out in June and July of 1397. Edward Langley, who was the Duke of York's son, was elevated to the Duke of Aumale. Thomas Mowbray, the snake-like figure that we've discussed a number of times, was elevated from Earl of Nottingham to becoming Duke of Norfolk. Richard elevated his half-brother John Holland to Duke of Exeter, and his other half-brother Thomas Holland to Duke of Surrey. A new figure on the scene was also elevated. John Beaufort, who was John of Gaunt's eldest child through his mistress Catherine Swynford, was elevated from the Earl of Somerset to the Marquis of Dorset. Okay, this is an incredibly high title. If you remember Robert de Vere, the title of Marquis was above that of dukedom. Now, the really surprising title was that Henry Bolingbroke, the former appellant, the man who had defeated Robert de Vere at Radcot Bridge, who had previously been Earl of Derby, became the Duke of Hereford. So Richard had awarded these members of nobility with new titles, but this had to be approved by the Commons at Parliament. Obviously, this was done straight away. No one wanted to get on the wrong side of Richard after what they had seen in September of 1397. But what else was agreed at this Parliament? Well, it was formally agreed that the actions of the appellants in 1388 were illegal, and that all judgments that had been made by Arundel and Gloucester should be overturned. One such act, if you remember, was that Michael Delapole, the former Chancellor who had been killed as part of the merciless Parliament, had his lands redistributed out to his members of family, so the other Delapoles. Richard also gave himself a large wool subsidy, so for all taxes on wool that were collected from imports and exports, Richard would take a share. This would be an incredible amount of money and would obviously increase the amount of money that the King's household would have. Richard also made all members of the Commons that were present at the Shrewsbury Parliament swear an oath that they would uphold the judgments that were made. So if any of them went back on their word, then this would be an act of treason. So far, it's looked fairly routine. This isn't a parliament that shows much significance. So why is it being called the suicidal parliament? Well, it all stems through a confrontation and dispute between two people that had previously been members of the appellants group and also had been part of this elevated nobility from the Shrewsbury Parliament. Henry Bolingbroke had arrived late to the Parliament, and what he did was he relayed a dispute that he had had with Thomas Mowbray, the Earl of Nottingham. What Henry told Richard was incredibly shocking, and Richard's actions following this disclosure of information is what ultimately led to Richard's downfall in 1399. So obviously in class we're going to look at what this conversation was about and what this dispute between Mowbray and Bolingbroke concerned and how Richard had responded to this. But we're also going to look at why Richard gave out a lot of new titles at the Shrewsbury Parliament and how Richard had given himself more power. And what we'll ultimately look at following the conversation between Bolingbroke and Mowbray is how did Richard ultimately sow the seeds that led to his downfall.